Center for International and Border Studies. It's a think tank group comprising of academic professionals and other interested persons who are working in the field of ensuring that we do some research which is both evidence-based and data-driven. And we have decided to have an input, to make an effort to contribute to the sensitization of the people of Guyana in relation to this very important issue of the border controversy between Venezuela and Guyana. With me, Mr. Neville December, Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Guyana, and Mr. Carl Greenwich, the Guyana government's advisor on borders and his agent at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which is adjudicating the Venezuelan, I would say, invalidity, because Venezuela is suggesting that the 1899 arbitral award, which was declared full, final, and perfect, is invalid. So here we are, and Mr. Willis will, in a sense, give you much more detail on that issue. We meet in this region, in several parts of Essequibo, under the confluence of three important rivers, the Mazaruni, Cuyuni, and Essequibo. And I think this is a very important location. And even the name Bartica, from my research, I think it's an Amazonian word. And I think those, the Cuyuni, Essequibo, and Mazaruni, are not Spanish words at all. They are words, and so therefore, one can argue here that in a region that has never been occupied nor been part of any Venezuelan territory or that of its colonial masters, Spain, we see where Essequibo has always been part of Guyana, and then before that, Guyana. I don't know, cede much of my time to my two colleagues, but suffice it to say that in relation to the claim, the very spurious claim of Venezuela, we've noted that since 1899, the arbitral award, which was seen as full, final, and perfect, and right up to 1962, when the Venezuelans arbitrarily decided to take this issue of validity to the United Nations after a posthumous memorandum by one of its lawyers. We've seen a range of aggressive actions by Venezuela over the years. We've seen the seizure of our half on Coco Island since 1966. We've seen pressure being placed on the international financial institutions when it's hindered our development thrust. We've seen in the 21st century the decrees annexing our maritime space by the government of Venezuela. We've seen most recently acts including an armed attack by armed Venezuelans on military servicemen. We've seen where there's been the movement of a Venezuelan vessel into Guyana's exclusive economic zone. We've seen this last week shooting the shots fired across the border into Guyana's territory from field areas aimed at our military servicemen. So we've seen those significant acts of aggression. And I think equally as important is this election, which Venezuela claims to be having tomorrow, on the eve, the day before Guyana celebrates or commemorates its 59th anniversary of independence from Britain. So I think this is a very important moment. It gives us here time to reflect, to understand more some of the issues that are involved in the spurious claim that Venezuela was before. And I believe that there's some areas which are important recommendations. I see the young students, and I believe that as part of policy, the education system in Guyana should now include borders, issues of borders as part of the curriculum. And I think if that's one takeaway, I would like to see the education officials suggesting that the curriculum be adjusted to include a component which deals with borders and sensitization of the student population, as well as a higher level of education and sensitization of the citizenry of Guyana in general, along with the international community. So my view also is that there ought to be consideration given to populating at a greater level the areas close to the border, with some incentives, financial and other, being given to the movement of Ghanaian people close to the borders, and maybe a program of agriculture, agri-industrial development, etc., being part of that policy. Those issues I think we can articulate and look at in question and answer and all the recommendations. But I think I will give the time to my two colleagues. First is December, the senior lecturer from the University of Guyana, and then to Mr. Bennett as they present their perspectives on the issue. Mr. December.
Thank you to Dr. Curtin, and in particular to the Center for International and Water Studies. Thanks, of course, to the Region 7 RDC for hosting us this very timely and important outreach. As we seek to inform the community, we've been going around the country, our citizens, and of course, the Essequibo who are here in particular. Thank you for coming out on a matter of national importance such as this. In fact, yes, you all are on the proverbial front line, as it were, of this exercise or charade or whatever it is that we may call it, whatever you want to call it, that Venezuela purports to have as an exercise tomorrow. So all credit and kudos go to Dr. Curtin and SIBS for the initiative, and I'm appreciative, of course, of the invitation to participate. I'm honored to be on such a distinguished panel, Mr. Carl Greenwich, the advisor on borders, and my senior academic colleague, Dr. Curtin. I'm a lawyer by training, an international lawyer, so I thought what I will try to do this afternoon is to simplify things, break it down a bit as regards the controversy between Guyana and Venezuela. So let's start at the beginning. Eh? We hear people say Essequibo is real, not a blade of grass. But some people don't know why. Why is this? Why is Essequibo real? Because Mr. Maduro said it's day one too. And we both can't be right, eh? Somebody got to be wrong. If you look at the car stickers, people driving wrong, Essequibo belongs to us. Who is the us? If you take that same sticker and put it on a car in Venezuela, say Essequibo belongs to us, they would say it's zero. It should really say Essequibo belongs to Guyana. In fact, some of them say that, but I think all of them should say Essequibo belongs to Guyana. Anyway, why is this so? The answer is simple. If you look at the history, if you look at the law, it's on our side. And I don't say that only because I'm a Guyanese. The indisputable facts are that the history, the law is on our side, and it has been so for over 100 years. You should know there is something called state practice, okay? The practice of states, which is the definitive statement by government officials, the official version of a government. People say you could take that to the bank, as it were. Well, for decades, the state practice of Venezuela has supported the contention that the country Guyana is as we know it on the map. All 83,000 square miles. And that was settled, as Dr. Corton alluded to, by the 1899 Arbitral Award. Again, so let's look at the history. Place names, as he said, Bartica. How we come about that? Anybody? No? Okay. The name Bartica originates from an Amerindian word meaning red earth. Well, or at least so it says on AI, on the internet. And you know everything nowadays is on the internet. The trick is you got to know what to believe and what not to believe, because there's a lot of nonsense and falsehood out there on the internet. But that's what it says for the name Bartica. And that Bartica was an Anglican missionary settlement in 1842 in Anna Regina. Anybody? You hear all kind of things, eh? How it was named by the Spanish, how Regina means queen, all kind of things. But Regina in Latin means queen. But the word for queen in Spanish is reina, okay? Not vagina. Don't let nobody fool you. That is a Spanish name. Previously, it was a Dutch plantation. It was later owned by an Englishman who had two daughters, Anna and Regina. Hence the name Anna Regina. The man named the place after his daughters. That is all. New Amsterdam. Anybody know where the old Amsterdam is, or the original Amsterdam? The Dutch in the Netherlands. If you look on the Essequibo coast that Mr. Maduro says is his own, Virgin Ocean, Eiflok. When I was growing up, I used to say Utiflok. All of those are Dutch place names in this Essequibo County that Venezuela is claiming, not Spanish names. Georgetown. Georgetown was named after King George by the British in 1812. You're hearing? 1812. Long before the Arbitral Award was given in 1899 after the tribunal sat in 1897. You should be aware also, Georgetown was once known as Stabroek, right? Stabroek Market, a name given to it by the Dutch in 1784, again, long before the Arbitral Award. If you look around Guyana, there are a lot of well-known names of Guyanese, names of British, Dutch, and French. So how come there are no Spanish names in Guyana? Besides, as I can recall, I don't know, Santa Rosa, that's the only one I can think about in the Northwest. But there's no other Spanish name. If you compare like Trinidad and Tobago, there's Port of Spain, San Fernando, Jamaica, Ocho Rios, and Port Antonio. How come there are no Spanish names in Guyana? Anybody? Because the Spanish were never here. Okay, they were never here. The English, French, Dutch place names, and the names of the officials or relatives, but no Spanish place names. And so that is why the Essequibo belongs to Guyana. So don't let anybody fool you with lies and fantasy and Nancy story. The Spanish, ladies and gentlemen, were never here. Okay, so let me highlight a few things which I believe can shed light on the issue. The current state of our relations with our friends on the western border, Venezuela, is essentially at their behest and insistence through the chicanery and reinterpretation of history. I use that term loosely, clearly. Reinterpretation of history. You should know, and really, the way that they behave, you would never believe it. You should know that the 1899 Arbitral Award came about at Venezuela's insistence. Way back then, in the 19th century, you know, in the 21st century, Venezuela took issue with UK colonization in South America. Remember, we were a British colony, yeah? British Guyana. Ask yourself, if Guyana is the only English-speaking country in South America, would Venezuela, or the Spanish before them during colonial time, would they have allowed that? If Guyana was ever at any time a colony of Spain, to let the British take it over? No. I don't think they would have allowed that. Again, if you look in South America, there's British Guyana, which is now Guyana, Dutch Guyana, now Suriname after independence, and there's still French Guyana, right? Well, how come there is no Spanish Guyana? Because the Spanish were never here. Well, nobody fooled. Incidentally, I was doing some research. there is a reference to Spanish Guyana, but there is a specific regard to the formation of what is known as the Guyana Shield. This is a geological and biodiversity rich area on the northeastern coast of South America. But it is not a political definition. It has nothing to do with occupation or possession of territory by Spain. It's just a geographical reference, okay? And from the dates I mentioned just now, 1784, 1812, 1842, these are all dates when colonies of what we know today as independent Guyana were either in the possession of the Dutch or the British, never the Spanish. Decades before the 1897 arbitration agreement, which was called the Treaty of Washington, that resulted in the 1899 award. That's why I said earlier, the history is on our side. We'll come to the law just now. So basically back then in the 19th century, Venezuela got together with the United States, its friend at the time, to have the matter of the ownership of the territory on the South American coast as far west as the Orinoco River, settled by an arbitral tribunal. Now, you should know that one of the attractions of an arbitration tribunal, unlike a court, is that the parties get to choose their judges. Right? In this way, you could feel comfortable that you have your representative on the court. So that if need be, your judge, right? Your man on the court, with the greatest of deference to the ladies, at the time this was a man's arrangement, at that time, back then, they could take care of your interests. And guess what? Venezuela chose 2 American judges. You hear me? Not 2 Venezuelan judges. 2 American judges. The British chose 2 British judges. Venezuela chose 2 American judges. It's the same Venezuela that turned back later and said they get robbed, the award was a conspiracy between judges, all kind of things. We come to that. So just to simplify it, right? Imagine you think you're getting shortchanged as regards the land that you own. Say you and your neighbor, you can't agree, you can't decide where to put the baling staves for the fence. And you all decide for the matter to go to an arbitration. And you go and choose 2, not 1, judges still from in the United States as your judges on the arbitration panel. Not 2 of your own, not 2 of your good friends, right? As we say, not 2 of your body partners. But you see, at the time, Venezuela and the US were so lovey-dovey and everything was so hunky-dory that they felt confident that in choosing 2 judges from the United States, the US would put pressure on the United Kingdom. Same United States that nowadays President Maduro cousin down and hating on. So the tribunal met in 1897, handed down the award in 1899. And guess what? Venezuela was as happy as a lark, because their focus at the time was securing the land area around the Orinoco River as a strategic commercial waterway. Not the Essequibo, maybe Mr. Greenwich might elaborate on that. Right? And so that is how the Essequibo was ours. Venezuela was never looking towards the Essequibo, they were looking towards the Orinoco. And that is why it belongs to Guyana. Now, remember I said earlier, I talked earlier about state practice, which say the foreign minister or the president of a country makes statements or takes a position which indicates the policy position of a government. Well, for the most part of the 20th century, right? The award was in the 19th century, 1899. Then we moved to the 20th century, and the 1905 agreement setting out the award was signed by Venezuela and the UK. Okay? Let's remember the sequence, all right? 1897, Treaty of Washington, setting out the arbitration agreement. When the arbitration panel was constituted, they met, deliberated, gave the award in 1899. And then I'm talking now about the agreement in 1905 that finalizes the award. It's a sequence of events, okay? The border was settled, and the state practice as declared by Venezuelan government officials throughout the 20th century clearly showed that they had accepted the border as demarcated then as a full perfect and final settlement. Okay, so we fast forward now, still in the 20th century, 1962, when Guyana opened discussions with the United Kingdom about our independence. And the Venezuelans, out of the blue, come big and bad as we would say, and they start questioning the award and reopening the matter. And guess what they based this on? A dead man's letter, believe it or not. A letter from a dead man. Well, all I have to say on that, dead men tell no tales. Anyway, in 1962, Venezuela all of a sudden wake up one day and get a brainwave, as we would say, suspiciously coincidental around the time we were in independence talks with the British. I don't know if any of y'all are history buffs. If you read the history, you'll see at the time there was an Neville December as legal advisor to the PNC involved in those discussions. It's not me. I'm sorry, I might have aged well, but it's not me. It's my father. All right, so I'm confused the two. That's Neville Senior. All right, Venezuela produced a letter signed by a Mr. Severo Malek Prevost, a junior lawyer on the Venezuelan legal team. He alleged that there was a conspiracy among the judges on the arbitration panel. He said the American judges on the panel were not impartial and they were influenced by the US government. Hello? The same two judges. The same two judges that Venezuela chose. Remember? Why did they choose two Venezuelan judges? The same two judges that they chose in 1897 from the US, 60 odd years after, in 1962, after they accept the 1899 award and the 1905 agreement on the award, after their state practice over the decades was consistent with the award, but the ups and we say in the Caribbean, get off ups and shout fraud, conspiracy, we get robbed, based on a letter released after the gentleman died. You know, I would say you can't make this stuff up, but really and truly in this case, the Venezuelans are making it up. Right? It's unbelievable that they would base their case primarily on this dead gentleman's letter. So we're in 1966 now, heading to independence, and Venezuela not backing down. All right, and we want independence. The solution that was found, like civilized nations, the same thing we're proposing now through the International Court of Justice to settle the issue diplomatically, like good neighbors, peacefully. The UK, Venezuela, and British Guyana met in London and Geneva, and they came up with the 1966 Geneva Agreement. Let me just allude quickly to some aspects of the agreement. It's really a couple pages now, nothing fantastic, but very important. 3-4 pages now. All right. Article 1. All right. You should know, and if you want to look it up on the internet, you just Google UK Venezuela Geneva Agreement 1966. There's no reference to border. Okay? There's a reference to a controversy. Right? There's no reference to a dispute, controversy. There's no reference to border. It talks about frontier. And if you look throughout the agreement, in Article 4.2, which is the most important paragraph, the word controversy appears 3 times. There is no reference to a dispute. All right? Neither is there a reference to a border. They talk about a frontier. Right? Also, there's something called a preamble to agreement. If you, I don't know, want to build a community center in Batika, and you would get together and the regional chairman and the mayor, they would set out in the preamble that there's a need for this project and the children are disadvantaged and they need to attract them into community-related activities and to keep them occupied. You put those kinds of things in the preamble, but then you actually set out the agreement, where it will be, the size of the building, the school, the playground, and so on. So the preamble sets the framework for the agreement. The preamble to the Georgetown Agreement that set the framework for it. There's 2 important references. One, it says, recognizing that closer cooperation between British and Guyana, listen to this, could bring benefit to both countries. That's the reason why they had the agreement. They acknowledged that they could both benefit from this agreement. Again, it said the controversy between the UK and British Guyana on the one hand and Venezuela prejudice the furtherance of such cooperation and should therefore be amicably resolved. Do you hear me? Amicably resolved, not putting troops on the border, not building a bridge by the Kiyuni, not holding no election, not holding no referendum, not appointing no governor. None of those things was envisaged by this agreement. As set out in the preamble, it says, therefore be amicably resolved. But this is where we reach now with our friends on the border. So that's why over the years, we refer to a controversy arising out of the Venezuelan contention that the 1899 Arbitral Award is null and void. That, in fact, is the language from Article 1. It talks about a controversy, so it's arisen, Venezuelan contention about the frontier. It says null and void. No reference to a border, no reference to a dispute. All right? And that's Article 1. So to be clear, we have no dispute, you know. We know quite well where the border is. We know where the border is. It's Venezuela that disagrees with the 1899 award. It's they who are disputing the 1905 agreement, not us. We have no dispute. But what we do acknowledge is that there is a controversy, and that is the language that is there in the Geneva Agreement. And that is why we insist, what? Essequibo belongs to Guyana. We have no problem with the map as it is. So, in the Geneva Agreement, there's also a reference to Article 33 of the UN Charter, which should become very important, but I can just tell you that it sets out the means for peaceful settlement of disputes, as we were trying to do in 1966, as we tried to do in 2018, when we approached the International Court of Justice, to settle it peacefully. There's reference to various methodology, conciliation, negotiation, judicial settlement. There is no reference to good offices, which is the good offices of the Secretary General. All right? So if there's no reference to good offices in Article 33 of the UN Charter, how come Guyana and Venezuela used good offices for more than 25 years after the UN Secretary General suggested that we go that route? How come? Because the parties had to agree to the choice of good offices made by the Secretary General at the time. In 1989, that was Mr. Javier Perez de Cuellar. And yet, Venezuela now saying that the current Secretary General, Mr. Gutierrez, did not have the authority to refer the matter to the ICJ. In 1989, they had no problem with the Secretary General at the time using good offices, which was something outside of Article 33, which he couldn't do unless we agreed. They agreed to that. Now, the same person as the Secretary General in 2018 said, look, let's go to the ICJ. They never agreed to that. But that's how our friends on the other side of the border operate. If you look at the judgment of the court, let me just do that quickly. As the judges were examining a Venezuelan document, this is what the court, the ICJ said. All right? Let's read it quickly. The possibility existed that an issue of such vital importance as the determination of the means of dispute settlement would have left the hands of the two directly interested parties, right? That's Guyana and Venezuela, would have left their hands to be decided by an international institution chosen by them, or failing that, by the Secretary General of the United Nations. Same man. Same office holder. All right? This is what they agreed to. Guyana and Venezuela in 1966, that the Secretary General should choose. Again, this is the court again. In this regard, the court observes that in his statement of 17th of March 1966, before the National Congress, on the occasion of the ratification of the Geneva Agreement, this is Venezuela now going to their national parliament to ratify the agreement. They're going to agree to it formally in their parliament. Listen to so, this is state practice. The Venezuelan Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Ignacio Ibarren Borges, in describing the discussion that that taken place at the Geneva Conference. Remember I told you they met in London and Geneva, they came up with the agreement. He's describing the discussions now. Asserted that, I'm quoting, the only role entrusted to the Secretary General of the United Nations was to indicate to the parties the means of peaceful settlement of disputes, provided in Article 33. He went on to state that having rejected, listen to this again please, carefully, having rejected the British proposal to entrust the role to the General Assembly of the United Nations, I'm quoting again, Venezuela had then suggested giving this role to the Secretary General. You hear who suggested? Not the United Kingdom. Venezuela suggested that the role must be given to the Secretary General. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the history. This is the state practice. This is the law upon which we base our case. I'm not making this up. I'm reading from the judgment of the court. This is the written record of Venezuela not agreeing but insisting on the role of the United Nations Secretary General to choose the means of settlement. The same role that they're now objecting to. So we just said they never agreed. It was Venezuela that chose the Secretary General over the United Nations General Assembly and insisted on his inclusion in the Geneva Agreement to perform that role. This is the last sentence. Venezuela had then suggested giving this role to the Secretary General. Please, I'm really not making this thing up. Yeah? That is the law, that is what obtains at present and has been so since 1966. So, if I just explain, it is Venezuela that insisted that in the drafting of the Geneva Agreement of 1966, the choice of a means of settlement from Article 33 of the Charter was to be done by the UN Secretary General, right? Not the General Assembly. And if Guyana and Venezuela had previously agreed in 1989 to the UN Secretary General proposing good offices as an alternative means of settling the dispute, even though good offices is not mentioned in Article 33, why then, in 2018, when the same United Nations Secretary General wrote the president of the two countries and said he had chosen the ICJ as the means of settlement, why then, how come could Venezuela come and say they don't agree, the SG has no authority, they never consented to this? When the history is there, from 66, from 1989, they agreed to it from a long time. Well, if you ask me, the simple answer, Venezuela knows that they have a weak case. Right? They know that the facts and the law are on our side. They know that if there is a settlement arrived at an impartial forum such as the ICJ, and my father used to say on the political hustings, cat eat your dinner. Cat is going to have their dinner. They have no case to stand on, no viable case. So let me turn briefly to what I believe is an important point, the issue of consent to the court's jurisdiction. The ICJ works on the basis of consent. Fine, we can agree on that. And Venezuela says they never agreed to the SG choosing the ICJ. Well, we just went with that. I showed them that, in fact, the court said yes, she had the role. And then they say, in any event, even if the Secretary General chose the ICJ, they don't consent to the jurisdiction in the case. I don't want to tell you how silly that is, because even though they say the court has no jurisdiction, they've been attending the court, making our presentations, and filing counter memorials to the arguments Guyana had previously. You could ask Mr. Greenwich, he's the agent for Guyana. Every time you go to the Netherlands, the Venezuelans are there. He sits here, they sit on the other side. They come to the court, they appear in the court, yet they're insisting they don't accept the jurisdiction. But it is what it is. So, let's look back briefly at Article 4.2 of the Geneva Agreement. The last sentence in particular. It says, the Secretary General of the United Nations shall choose another of the means stipulated in Article 33 of the Charter, and so on, until the controversy has been resolved or until all the parties of all the means of peaceful settlement they contemplated have been exhausted. Right? Let me repeat that, until the controversy has been exhausted. Again, listen to what the court had to say. Just read it quickly. It said the willingness of the parties to resolve the controversy definitively is indicated by the fact that the means which listed include arbitration or judicial settlement, which are by nature binding. You go to an arbitration, it's binding. You go to a court, it's binding. So if they agree to that, they intended for it to be binding. The phrase, and so on until the controversy has been resolved, also suggests that the parties conferred on the Secretary General the authority to choose the most appropriate means for a definitive resolution of the controversy. Not back and forth and you tell the man have authority, then you come back and say you don't have authority. No, that's not how it works. The court considered that the Secretary General's choice of a means that leads to the resolution of the controversy fulfills his responsibility under Article 4.2 of the Geneva Agreement in accordance with the object and purpose of the instrument. In other words, you can't second guess the Secretary General. Right? This will amount to any of the parties, Guyana or Venezuela, holding the Secretary General to ransom, as it were, like a veto power, if they didn't agree to his choice for settling the matter. By Venezuela saying that they do not consent to the jurisdiction of the court, we'll be going wrong and wrong in circles. After they agreed since 1966, we're just going wrong in circles. A never-ending process, and so the controversy would never be resolved. As with the last sentence that I just read to you, it's resolved to the satisfaction of everybody. So don't let anybody tell you that the parties did not agree to judicial settlement. I'm conscious of the time, and I wanted to say a few words on something that had come up in the media recently about Venezuela insisting that instead of going to the ICJ, we should have bilateral negotiation. They refer to bilateral negotiation. After the 2023 Argyle Agreement in St. Vincent with President Ali and President Maduro, and more recently, they returned to the baseless assertion again in recent days, claiming that they're not bound by the ICJ's or the provisional measures prohibiting tomorrow's election, and yet you wonder why there has been no campaign, no registration, no arrangement being made. I ain't seen no ballot box, no polling station out there. I ain't seen nothing like that. And yet they're insisting that they would prefer to go the bilateral route. If you look at the Geneva Agreement, it's just a few pages. There's nothing in here. There's nothing in here that talks about bilateral negotiations. And as I said, I think they don't want a court settlement because they know that the case is weak and they're going to lose. I mean, let me ask you, if you're so sure of the righteousness of your position, of your case, why don't you want to go to the court and contest the issue in a civil and diplomatic manner for the whole world to see? What you afraid of? Huh? No. They want to negotiate behind closed doors, just we and them, so that they could use their political and military might to wrest some kind of territory, some kind of land concession from us. And what we say? What? Not a blade of grass. Mr. Greenwich can tell you firsthand how difficult it is to negotiate with our friends in Caracas. Old people say it's like pulling teeth. A difficult set of folks to negotiate with. So they have based this reference to bilateral negotiations and the Geneva Agreement. There's nothing in the Geneva Agreement that talks about bilateral negotiation. But there's another sentence I wanted to read to you in Article 5.2. Listen to this. It says, no new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty in these territories, as the territory that we discussed in our agreement, shall be asserted while this agreement is in force. All right? While this agreement is in force, they must do nothing new. All right? Which they agreed to. So they say that bilateral negotiations are provided in the Geneva Agreement. I challenge anybody here to show me where in this agreement, these couple pages, it makes provision for bilateral negotiation. But as I just draw your attention to Article 5, Paragraph 2, the last sentence. In other words, so long as the Geneva Agreement is enforced, you can't make any new claim. Okay? Agreed? That's what it says. I just read it to you. Alright? So then, while the agreement is enforced, you're not supposed to make no new claim. You're not supposed to hold no referendum in the Essequibo, build no bridge over the Kiyode River to Ankoko Island, not declare Essequibo as part of Venezuela, not appoint no governor, not hold elections. Everything that the agreement just said, no new claims shall be made, them doing. Which is in the Geneva Agreement, and in this here Geneva Agreement, they want to be enforced for some mysterious, fanciful bilateral negotiations, which are not stated in the agreement. So the things that are stated in the agreement, that are prevented by the agreement they're doing, and they want us to do something that is not in the agreement. Well, my goodness, for me, that is jumbled up thinking. That is the most illogical arrangement we could ever come to. So, we can, I guess, wait in vain for, as Bob Ali would say, from Venezuela to show us where this reference to bilateral negotiations is. It's not there. I just want to say in closing that unfortunately, this matter was raised recently by the Chargé d'Affaires of the Chinese Embassy when in a public statement he mentioned that we should resort to bilateral negotiations, which is Venezuela's position. And I think that's very unfortunate. China is a friend of ours. China is a permanent member of the Security Council, so we would hope that that was just diplomatic overreach and the Chinese would not agree to that because they have been friends. You see the Chinese building the Demerara Bridge, how much projects are building at the airport. So it's surprising that the Chinese would publicly say that. Venezuela can say it, them say what they want, right? When it suits them, some things they pick and choose. They're insisting that something that is not in the agreement, bilateral negotiations, and things that are precluded by the agreement, they don't want to go along with. Really, I don't know. Maybe if you want to simplify it, this is like Venezuela behaving like a schoolyard. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when you try to apply logic to an illogical situation. A real back to front argument, if you look at the provision. So, with that, I think I can leave it there. I hope I have been able to explain a few things, set a few things straight, and generally inform you as to how and why it is that Essequibo belongs to Guyana. Thank you, Mr. President.
Advisor on borders and his agent at the International Court of Justice, and he's going to present his perspective. Mr. Gullet.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curtin. Mr. Regional Chairman and colleagues, Madam Mayor, and other friends, and especially young ladies and gentlemen who have joined us today, whether they come from Bartico or Iteringban. I'm very happy to have you join us today so that you can listen, and if you have any questions or you disagree with anything, you can tell us afterwards. But the main thing is to have our young people share some of the issues, the knowledge of the issues and the history of Guyana and the challenges that it faces as regards its borders. Okay? That is the purpose of today's exercise. And I'm going to ask you to forgive me if at some point there is a little bit of repetition. I'm going to, not to repeat for the sake of repeating, but to look at some of these things that have been explained to you by my colleagues from a different angle. The same dates may arise. Okay, 1966 will appear, 1899 will appear and reappear until you're tired of hearing it. And we are in 2025. I hope that by the time we get to the end of 2025, we will be able to say definitively that these problems will be resolved by the end of 2026. But I can't tell you that for sure. Let me start by going back to basics. Those of you who live in Bartica probably have a better idea of the borders of Guyana, or at least the borders as they relate to Venezuela, than people in Berbice or in Demerara. And the question I want to draw your attention to is that a border is a very important thing. If you cross a border between countries, you will find that the countries have different governments. When you cross the border, you may find them speaking different languages. You cross the border, on the other side of the border, you will find different laws. You may find that you're accustomed to driving on the left-hand side of the road, and on the other side of the border, people are driving on the right. What does that mean? It means you're going to have chaos. If you don't know where the border is, and you don't know what rules apply on that piece of the road or that bit of ocean that you're in. So the border and the discussion of borders is exceedingly important. It's what they call existential. If you don't know where your borders are, they're not going to survive. You may not survive because you may get killed in the process. So I'm trying to emphasize for you the importance of this issue of the border. We have an issue with Venezuela over the border. You read in Wikipedia, which is not a place that I go for knowledge, you get much misinformation there. They will tell you Guyana and Venezuela had a dispute over their border for over 100 years. In fact, the border of Venezuela and Guyana was settled in 1899. Venezuelan president, the Venezuelan president's brother was the ambassador who participated in the negotiations, who persuaded the Americans, helped to persuade the Americans to press the British to have an arbitration panel. Arbitration is like a court. It's like a court. And when two people or two countries can't disagree, you ask that court to sit and to resolve the problems between them. That is what happened in 1899. The rules were set in 1897, as Mr. December pointed out, and Venezuela accepted the outcome. Okay? Most of the discussion and argument was about how important the Orinoco was to Venezuela. It is one of the most important rivers in South America. It drains probably more, for those of you that, well, if you come from this area and the non-mining areas, you know that drainage is important. If you're going to farm, you have to be able to plant and be sure that the land isn't going to be flooded by the time you would like to harvest. So the significance, I don't think they want to see my face. You folks here can see my face, can't you? Good, well, so it doesn't matter with them. They can hear me. I'm saying to you that as regards these borders, the Orinoco issue is important, as is Essequibo. If you are a piece of land, 10 acres or 20 acres, and that land is drained by a trench or a creek, it's going to make a difference to how you can plant, whether you can plant and eat. The Orinoco accounts for the drainage of the bulk of Venezuela. Just as Essequibo River drains over half of Guyana. And those people that came to Bartica and settled in Bartica even prior to 1830 and 1831 could not have come here if they didn't have access to the river. In other words, if the river was controlled by Venezuelans, you would not have been able to be here today. Essequibo River gives you access to the south and to the southwest of Guyana through the river itself and through its tributaries. Again, these were mentioned to you a minute ago. Okay? And the Essequibo River allows you to go as far as reaching Brazil, or almost. The origin of the Essequibo River is, of course, in the Takatu. But the river is very close to the borders of Brazil. And that is one of the reasons why Venezuela is interested in it. Not to drain lands by Caracas, but for military and strategic purposes. Because the river Essequibo carries you close to Brazil and to Suriname. Suriname is not aware of that and the risk that that imposes. But I will leave you with that without saying much more. The point I'm trying to make is that when you draw borders, how the borders or where the borders are drawn are important. It's not just another thing appearing out of history. And in the case of Guyana and its borders, which were settled in 1899, those borders and the maps that were agreed subsequent to the arbitration in 1905 and then were supplemented by negotiations with Brazil in 1928, giving you a tri-junction point where Guyana's borders meet with Brazil's borders, meet with Venezuela's borders. This was examined by the surveyors in 1928, and the lines were drawn and agreed in 1931. By whom? Venezuela, British Guyana, Britain, and Brazil. So when you tell someone that the border that Guyana has is wrong, you are not only to ask Guyana to talk to you about the border, because the border also affects Brazil. But why is it that Venezuela comes to Guyana and raises all this nonsense? Because this is what Guyanese or Creole would call I-pass. I-pass. Before that border was settled in 1899, there were several other agreements. Let me just mention them for you quickly. Those agreements determined whether a particular European state or the other controlled the territories that constituted Guyana and, at the time, of course, British Guyana, that's what it was called. But before it was British Guyana, these were three different colonies. They were separate places, governed by, first of all, the Pope, who was a very generous man. He was half Portuguese and half Spanish. And he decided that all of the world, which was at that time what they called terra nullius, empty land. Of course, these are Europeans, okay? So although there are Amerindians there, they call it empty land. But of course, we know that it wasn't empty land. These were lands occupied by our people. And he told them that they can go and give these lands to Portuguese and Spanish settlers, businessmen, nobility, for as long as they are prepared to be Christians. So the world, as he saw it, was divided up and given away in this way. And the point, again, that I want to make here is that the land was not unoccupied. People were given land if they were Spanish or Portuguese. But other Europeans objected to that arrangement, and the Dutch in particular refused to accept it. And you had, in 1621, the Dutch West India Company being given land to settle people in Essequibo. So the Pope gave the land to the Spanish. The Dutch West India Company came along and gave that land to those whoever they could mobilize, because the Dutch brought anybody, not only Dutchmen. And now to help you with confusion, in 1648, the Netherlands, that is the Dutch people who were part of a Spanish empire, they were fighting for their freedom and won their freedom in 1648. And they were told, you can now be free from the Spanish king and the Spanish king's rules and laws. Okay? Go about your business. But since you insisted on having your colonies, and the colonies were Berbice, Demerara, and Essequibo. In 1648, under the Treaty of Munster, the Dutch got their freedom and these colonies went with them. I'm not wanting to overwhelm you with the time story. I'm just trying to explain to you how it is that we've ended up in a situation in which we ourselves have some difficulty understanding. Essequibo, which was always part of a tripartite arrangement, Demerara, Berbice, and Essequibo, after 1648, which is 300 years and more, could find itself being claimed by a country which doesn't know the front of Essequibo from the back. So, that is the challenge that we were faced in trying to deal with this question of Venezuela and its claims. As was pointed out to you before, in 1899, Venezuela asked for a certain arrangement, an arbitration panel. The arbitration panel has pronounced, and today, in 2025, Venezuela is claiming that the arbitral award is invalid. But who is it that asked for the arbitration in the first instance? It was Venezuela. We find ourselves in a situation where the complaint against arbitration was made by a young lawyer. Not that I have anything against young lawyers, but we are not sure that it is actually he who wrote the letter that said that fraud was committed. A letter was written, but we don't know that Malé Prévost wrote such a letter. And what I'm trying to point out to you, is that many of the allegations being made by Venezuela are unproven. And one of the problems, one of the reasons why this matter has to go to a court is because the two sides can't agree. Venezuela says, yes, although the evidence from Malé Prévost has never been submitted to a court. The evidence about the historical settlement of Essequibo was given to the arbitration panel in 1899. They had 6,000 pages of documents examined, 6,000 pages, and 3 months of arguments, non-stop. You couldn't solve it after all of that talking. Are you going to be able to solve it today by going and speaking to Mr. Maduro, saying, hello, Mr. Maduro, do you remember what happened in 1899, or do you remember what happened in 1648? No, it makes no sense. When you have an issue or a dispute between people and can't be resolved, the place to go is a court. And between countries, there is a court established specifically for dealing with disputes between countries. That is the International Court of Justice. And if you are a member of the United Nations, you are automatically entitled to be part of the International Court of Justice. But that carries a price. If you are a member of the United Nations, and the court is dealing with a matter that deals with you, your country, when it makes a decision, you are bound by that decision. You can't wake up, have you seen Mr. Maduro saying every 2 minutes, we didn't agree to the court. You agreed by joining the UN. And on top of that, in the period 2016 to 2017, the end of 2017, Mr. Maduro's minister and myself were involved in negotiating what they call enhanced mediation. This is a more intense way of dealing bilaterally between the two countries on the problem. And when they saw that the decision wasn't going their way, they suddenly cut out. Have any of you ever played cricket? Tip and run, for example. You know tip and run? Do you know tip and run? You don't know tip and run? You don't play cricket? In Georgetown, they call it one tip. Young ladies play cricket these days. There's a West Indies cricket team of women. The point I'm making is that the rule is, well, you can have it in football. You play football? You don't play football? Do you play football, madam? Okay. I hope you're not one of these people who, when the game starts and you start losing, you pick up the ball and you go home. This is Mr. Maduro. This is Mr. Maduro. So he goes to the court in 1899. He didn't go, but it's pretty sad. They lose the case. They agree to accept the outcome. They agree. No, it's worse than that. They agree. They help to mark the line of the boundary. They agree with the Brazilians on a new boundary where all the three boundaries meet. And in 1962, they suddenly say, you know, we never agreed to that. And if you read the Venezuelan publication, you will see it says in 1899, all of Venezuela rejected the outcome of the award. Untrue. Untrue. They accepted it because the Orinoco was the prize. That's what they wanted. It is perhaps the second most important river in South America, and as a world river, it is probably the most important of the world rivers in terms of the water that it carries, the significance of its capacity to drain the land. Remember, we started off with agriculture. I did agricultural economics and used to get paid. So I always go back to agriculture at some point. But seriously, what I'm saying to you is that was the reason why Venezuela was keen to accept the result, and they did accept the result. And here we are being told they never accepted the result. It is untrue. Just as it is untrue to say Essequibo is a Spanish word, and it came from the Spaniards. This proved that it's the Spanish who settled territory. Nonsense. Essequibo is an indigenous Indian word, okay? It means either a fireplace or a long journey. The stones that make up a fireplace. You know, in the old days, when you're cooking, you're using wood. You have to use some stones to keep the pots off of the ashes and the wood, and therefore that is the name that the indigenous people gave the river. And here it is, Mr. Maduro and the Venezuelans are suggesting Amerindians are so stupid that they waited 2,000 years to name a river. They had to wait until a man named Esquivel came. And he says, oh, this is a nice river, why don't we name it Esquivel? But this is nonsense. The river had a name, just like Berbice River had a name. It got its name from something that the indigenous people thought was important. In Berbice, it was named after wild bananas. That is what Berbice means. This is the wild bananas. And Demerara, if you look at the Demerara River, it's a very muddy river. And that's what it got its name from. So these things didn't arise from any discovery by the Spaniards here. And by the way, the fact that the Spanish named it is of no significance to Venezuela. Venezuela is not Spain. Venezuela is a different country. Spain gave Venezuela its independence. In 1830, 1831, it was recognized by the United States. The Berbice Rebellion took place in 1763. And you see Maduro telling us that in 1777, the Captaincy General of Spain named Essequibo as part of Venezuelan territory. But what did I tell you? In 1648, the Dutch got their independence and they were given Essequibo, Berbice, and Demerara with it. So, what I'm pointing you to is that a lot of the issues we're dealing with involve fiction. Mr. December put it perhaps a little more polite. Make up story, or I forgot the term you used. But I'm speaking here, a lot of what you will see the Venezuelans telling you on the television, on the videos, is fabricated. It is just like the word, the names of the rivers are being claimed by Venezuela because they're Spanish and they're not, Venezuela itself not Spanish anyhow. These place names are fabricated. So we went through a process, Nancy's story. So we have been forced to go through a process where Guyana, in order to solve the problem, as I say, if the two sides can't agree, you have to go to a court or an arbitration panel. We've done that in the case of Venezuela. Before we had the arbitration panel, the Dutch and the French and the English at various points signed agreements handing the Essequibo, or agreeing that Essequibo belonged to or was going to be transferred from Spain to other territories. So you had a treaty in 1802, 1803, the Treaty of Amiens, in which Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands confirmed that the Essequibo was going to go back to the Netherlands. And it isn't going to the Netherlands from Spain, it was going to the Netherlands from France. You had a series of massive wars across Europe called the Napoleonic Wars. I'm sure all of you here would have heard of Napoleon. He's one of the world's greatest generals, perhaps second only to Alexander the Great. But Napoleon's great contribution was he helped the Frenchmen overrun Europe. But in the course of that, the Venezuelans rebelled. And whilst Napoleon and the Spaniards were trying to deal with their problem in Europe, Venezuela declared independence, and they followed over 50 years of wars in this part of the world between Spain and its colonies. Venezuela became a place that was called Gran Colombia. Gran Colombia. Until 1831, when it eventually broke away from Colombia and became Venezuela. I'm telling you all of this because the history is not quite as straightforward as Mr. Maduro's chronicles or historians make out. It's a more complicated story. Essequibo never moved from the Dutch, never moved from the Spaniards to the English. It moved from the Spaniards to the Dutch, and from the Dutch to Britain. And whilst it was run by the Dutch and whilst it was run by Britain, there were several points at which it went back one way or the other, including going to the French. That is why you find in Essequibo L'Alliance, where, for example, you had the 1833 uprising. Yes, Damon, the uprising that took place. But anyway, there was an uprising by the slaves, part of the process of getting our independence came through slavery. In the case of Venezuela, that wasn't involved. And that process never involved any Venezuelans. The freedom of people in Guyana had nothing whatsoever to do with Venezuela. They weren't involved in the struggle for the abolition of slavery. And just as Simon Bolivar left Venezuela or Gran Colombia to go and hide in Jamaica for some years, he never came to this part of the world. He never set foot in the Essequibo. Okay? He never set foot in the Essequibo. So, I'm saying to you, before Essequibo became part of Guyana, it was a colony. That is one of the pieces of land owned by Spain. Then it became a piece of land owned by the Dutch. And when the Dutch got their independence, all the 3 colonies went to the Netherlands or to Holland or what it was called United Provinces. And when those territories went to the United Provinces, there were a number of changes. But I'm saying that by the time you now get to the 1899 award, there was no question of the territory belonging to Venezuela. It had never been part of Venezuela. It was originally part of Spain, and then it eventually ended up as part of Britain because the Dutch lost the battles of the Napoleonic Wars. And we find now that Venezuela raised an objection. The process that Venezuela agreed to, and I don't want to go through all of those, but the processes they agreed to had led to certain results. They were unhappy with those results. So they're going to pick up the ball and they'll leave the ball field. We started a process, as I mentioned to you, with the Venezuelans in 2016 called Enhanced Mediation. Minister Ariazo and myself and our teams negotiated that exercise. It ended in 2017, at which point the 2 sides could not agree. And as Mr. December was pointing out, once the 2 sides can't agree, the Secretary General is empowered to choose the next step, the next means. It wasn't meant to solve the problem. Again, I'm telling you things. If you follow what I'm saying, you will see all of them arising in the speeches of Mr. Badura. The Secretary General wasn't given the task of solving the problem. He was given the task of choosing the means by which the problem would be solved. And it is by that means that we've landed in the court. And we were at the court today, and during the processes which the court is undergoing, and it has many processes. Let me name 3 of them to you, because people keep asking. Up to yesterday, the students at St. Stanislaus were asking, or not the students, some of the teachers were asking, isn't this case finished already? We heard something announced on the news 2 weeks ago. No, it is a long process. The court has first of all to decide on jurisdiction. Does it have the power to look at the case? Mr. December dealt with that. It then has to look at objections arising from either Venezuela or Guyana. Guyana had no objection. Venezuela had objections. It said the British should participate because they signed the agreement in 1899. The court threw all of those out. Now, the court is looking at the substance, if you like, what they call this, the merits. They call it the merits. They're looking at the merits. Is Guyana right? Is Venezuela right? No, of course, if you're looking at a story that runs so many decades or over so many centuries, there are going to be questions, or there are going to be points at which the 2 sides agree, 2 sides don't agree. Principles arise and principles have to be decided by the court. What you are seeing and what you will see between now and 2016 is the court may well be giving decisions on points that arise, but no final decision is going to be made by the court. None of the decisions that you make, that you will see, will be a decision that says, okay, the 1899 award is valid and Venezuela must live by it. That is what Guyana hopes will happen come 2026. But I'm saying to you, in the meantime, the court has various things. One of them arose recently where Venezuela was in the process of launching a referendum. Now, can you imagine? This is the height of ludicrousness. Venezuela wants to decide, and Mr. Maduro wants his people to decide whether the laws that apply in Guyana should be Venezuelan laws. So, somebody in Caracas or somebody in Portadas or somewhere else is going to decide whether or not Venezuela's law that says if you say Guyana is Essequibo is in Guyana and you can either get jailed or lose your life, you haven't been party to that decision. People outside of Guyana's boundaries are going to decide by voting in a referendum that Venezuela's laws will apply to you as Guyanese. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is really what we're faced with by our neighbor. No Guyanese is to be involved even in now what he calls an election. That election is being held, he claims, in Essequibo. We know very well that the people who are going to be voting insofar as they may have Guyanese connections will be Waraos who live in the estuary of the Essequibo, the estuary of the Orinoco, outside of Guyana's boundaries. Now, of course, he has a right to ask or fool up his people as much as he likes. That's his right. A president can fool his public if they want to be fooled. But he, under international law, does not have a right to ask those people that he's fooled up in Guyana to decide on how Guyanese live and whether they live or die, because that is what he is in the process of doing. That is what he's in the process of doing. And so the court has to pronounce on these things. We have issued or going to the court to say to the court, this is what Venezuela has been doing. And so the court stops looking at the merits and then looks at the right and wrong or the legal or illegality of Venezuela trying to do the things I mentioned, like elections and so forth. Okay? So there will be other things. I'm sure there will be other outrages committed by Mr. Maduro between now and the time that the court finishes. But what I want you to understand is when you read the headline saying the ICJ or the World Court has given a decision, unless the ICJ has said the 1899 award is valid or it's not valid, it is not the final decision. Okay? It is a long process, and I'm saying to you, it has several elements. There are at least 4 critical elements, as I mentioned, jurisdiction and so forth. So that is what is going through now. Because many people who follow the case don't always understand why it is that they hear the court has made a decision and we haven't yet been told, yes, you were right, Essequibo is yours. Essequibo is no less Guyana's than is Demerara or Berbice. Unfortunately, the way that lawyers work, and apologies to present company accepted, these have always been part and parcel of one single group of countries. There was never a time when Essequibo was separated, never separated from Demerara. As a matter of fact, we used to have a Director General named Trotz. Some of you may know that name. It still is a Guyanese name. Director General Trotz, he was a Dr. Trotz, a doctor of laws. He came here, and Dr. Trotz was the Director General of Demerara and Essequibo. That colony, Demerara and Essequibo, were joined by the British, by the Dutch, and they were called Two Rivers. Two Rivers. And when eventually the British merged them in 1831, they became British Guyana. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't be confused by the names, don't be confused by languages. Suriname was a Dutch colony also, but they were treated differently because they were governed by a different arrangement. Berbice even was governed by a different arrangement for some time. There was a French family, which was a Dutch, presumably Belgian family, governing Berbice. But in Essequibo, as with Demerara, it was the Dutch West India Company that controlled and governed Essequibo. And those of you that would have traveled up in the river and gone to see the old Fort Island and the areas around there, will see reference. You will see reference to the Dutch Church, okay? You'll see reference to the Dutch West India Company, and you will see reference to the Combined Court. That is, and just the last point on the historical side, from the time of the establishment of the colony, Essequibo, Demerara, to make Two Rivers, they were governed by a Dutch institution called, this is the Combined Court, or the Court of Policy. These two governed Essequibo, they governed Demerara, and eventually they were to govern the individual, the combined colonies until they were abolished in the 1830s. What I'm trying to point you to is the fact that Essequibo's history is integrally linked to that of the Demerara and Berbice. They've never been separated in any meaningful sense. Whilst Berbice was separate, they always think that they're special from those people from Berbice. The facts are that Demerara and Essequibo were governed jointly. So the disputes and the debates that you will be seeing, doubtless they'll continue. I'm trying to say to you, bear in mind there's a line of continuity. Just as Trots appeared in Guyana in 1750-something, and you find Trots, Mr. Trots was one of his relatives, one of his descendants, governing one of the coconut plantations in the Pomeroon, which is in Essequibo. And you will find a Dr. Trots who was a researcher at the University of Guyana and a Commonwealth Science Advisor, showing you also that Essequibo has generated some of our most distinguished people, including Professor or Dr. Mohammed Shahabadi, our Attorney General for many years under President Burnham, who became the chairman of the International Criminal Court and the predecessor to the ICJ as it is now. This was a Guyanese born in Essequibo. Dr. Reed was also from Essequibo. Clarence Ellis, the first deputy governor of the Central Bank of Guyana and one of our finest public sector economists, Clarence Ellis, some of the greatest artists of Guyana, not surprising, were born in Essequibo. Some of the best artists, the best known artists of Guyana. In fact, the only man of African descent who is in the Royal Society in Britain was born right here in Essequibo. So what is it that Venezuela is telling us? That these people are Venezuelans. They're not Venezuelans culturally. They weren't born in a Venezuela physically. This is a different country, a different culture. Okay, so that is all I want to say. There are many, many things. We don't have time today to go through all of this, but I hope that I've pointed to enough interesting elements of this dispute and controversy to whet your interest. Thank you very much for being so attentive. The thoughts that he was airing whilst we were buying him lunch. You know these lawyers, if you pay, they will tell you anything. When they have to pay is a different story. But before I hand back to my myself and Dr. Curtin, let me say we have the first weapon of defense, and that is diplomacy. Guyana, in fact, after we changed up our arrangements, I started with some comments telling you how borders are defined, and then secondly, showing the extent to which Guyana depends upon and has depended upon diplomacy to defend itself. We are a tiny country, although Guyanese like to think this is a big country. It certainly isn't big relative to Venezuela. Essequibo is very small compared to Orinoco, either the river or the delta. And so, as a small country, you have to recognize certain things. You have to make as many friends as you can. It's not like an individual. We as individuals need friends, but you don't have to make as many friends as you can. You need to make, well, I would think it would be best to make as many friends as you need. But as a state, with no military power of consequence, you need to be friendly with as many countries as possible. You need to upset as few countries as possible. You need to assist as many other countries as possible. When they have problems, you have to be at the UN or elsewhere. Mr. December used up a lot of my money when I was paying taxes to go to the UN and help to defend other countries when they were having difficulties, whether it was about their neighbors or whether it was about international policy. You have to do that. You got to spend money, train diplomats, send diplomats to talk to neighbors, send diplomats to countries that you may not like, send diplomats to countries that are your friends, send diplomats and envoys to countries that tell you they're going to vote for you and support you. You got to still send people to them, because although they may say that, when the time comes, they may either forget, or they have no intention of doing it. So you have to keep them alert, and they have to know that you are always looking at them. You did them favors in the past, and you will expect favors in return. And they will need favors in future. You will remember whether or not they assisted you. So you have to speak to friend and enemies alike. Diplomats cost money. Unfortunately, some of our governments don't understand that. You're not doing the diplomat a favor. You're doing yourself a favor, because that enables you to protect yourself. You don't wait until a problem arises to go talk to a country that's giving you problems. You have to start early, setting the ground early. And I'm sorry to take long, because I know a lot of people expect you to say, oh, we're going to have 900 or 90,000 troops coming from Suriname and Colombia. The chances are nothing like that is going to happen. And it shouldn't happen if you do your work properly. Okay? The extent to which you can't help that is when you don't do your groundwork. And what we have to do is, even at this point in time, to invest as much of our resources as we can in strengthening our diplomatic service, which will help us to make friends. It will help us to keep friends where we have friends. It will help us to communicate with those who do not have our interests at heart. You've got to do that externally. You've got to do it internally. If people know that you're going to give them trouble by marching across your borders, it will cost them lives, it will cost them money. They will think twice before they cross your border. So that is the simplest and most honest answer there is. There are lots of other things you can do. Yes, we don't have military agreements with other countries who would normally, as is the case with some of our neighbors, summon neighbors and they'll come to your rescue. You have to wait until something arises and then call upon them to assist you. But Mr. Curtin has also had experience in an arena that is of relevance in relation to this question. So,
Well, I would also support the view that our first line of defense must continue to be diplomacy. At the same time, however, I would posit that we must enhance our military assets. We know that our quality or numbers are low in terms of, servicemen and women. But I think that one has to ensure that with the new technologies that are available now, that we enhance the military asset base as quickly as possible to ensure we're not an aggressive force, but we must be able to defend. And I think that's a significant difference. And at the same time, I believe that we must enhance the alliances where they exist and try to create new allies where they're not. And therefore, I would support my colleague, Mr. Greenidge, in arguing for an enhanced diplomatic effort. I believe that there should be special envoys moving, because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs alone cannot do that. I think we should be in capitals of the world and in other organizations and agencies, showing and demonstrating the correctness of Ghana's position. So I think it should be multifaceted, both diplomatic and the enhancement of military capability. But as I hand it over now to my colleague.
Thanks. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago, as Mark said. It was actually entitled "Diplomacy Must Be Our First Line of Defense." I was in the Foreign Service for diplomacy for more than 3 decades. As a young diplomat in the Foreign Service, working with people like Mr. Rasheed Jackson, they always used to tell us diplomacy must be our first line of defense, and I was even supported by some of the senior people in the military. Now we're practical, we're realists. In the article, I should have brought it in you. Let's give you some practical examples. The 2 helicopters we bought the other day, one unfortunately crashed. Venezuela have 9. Listen to me, it's just the 2 helicopters we buy, they have 9 of them. We now have 1. They have something called F-30, it's the new model to the F-16 fighter jet. One of those things out of the shop, I think is $40 million United States dollars. You hear me? $40 million United States dollars for one. They have a fleet, I think, of 16. Venezuela have submarines. They have Navy destroyers. The military, depending on how you count them, including reservists or not, the number I've seen varies from 700,000, which is our population. Listen to me, their army is as big as our population, from 700,000 to 1 million. That's why for decades, as a small developing country, we have used that mantra, diplomacy must be our first line of defense. And we have used it to good advantage. Right? There's a difference how you can deal with a dispute, talking, as opposed to any kind of military or aggressive action. People should know that over the years, as Mr. Greenidge said, tiny guy, in the non-aligned movement, okay? Venezuela had applied to join the non-aligned movement, right? And we were a powerhouse in the non-aligned non-aligned movement. Okay, fine, the non-aligned movement since the end of the Cold War and so on doesn't have that same relevance and importance, but at the time, Venezuela applied to join the non-aligned movement, and we were able to mobilize our colleagues in the non-aligned movement to block Venezuelans' application to join. Why? Because we explained to the non-aligned movement, we put no troops on no border, we fly no jet over the Ethereum Bank. We put no warship in the waters. We explained in a room in a conference meeting, diplomatically and civilly, that the principles that the non-aligned movement espoused, for instance, non-interference in the internal affairs of state, peaceful settlement of dispute, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. We told the non-aligned movement, Venezuela can't come into the non-aligned movement because they don't respect those foundational principles that for years, they never forgive us. For years, this tiny Guyana, without firing one shot, was able to keep Venezuela out in the non-aligned movement. Things have changed, we moved on. Things changed. Mr. Chavez came in, he took a different approach, and things changed. Now, the other thing is, if you look at the track record, in the past, Venezuela has done us great, well, I use the term, make it worse, disservices. They used to block financial assistance for us since Mr. Boredom time. You know, some of the youngsters didn't know, there's something called the Upper Mazarudi Hydro Project. It would have transformed this country from since then to bring electricity to hydropower. The Venezuelan blocked the loan of the IDB. More recently, there's something called a Beale Aerospace Project. They were to build a rocket launching site in the Essequibo. Venezuela blocked that. Those things are called economic aggression. Right? They were able to use their political and economic might and their influence to block those things. But militarily, the experience is not as grave. I think the question was asked is they want to come across the border if they're going to come. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think any of my colleagues has a crystal ball. But if you look at the track record, they've done things. You know, like in the schoolyard, and he said, no more grant me. He just grant me. No, I'm not stupid. Because someone may say, oh, you think of granting, and they do something. But if you look at the history, like and Mr. Greenwich was foreign minister, they seized a drill ship. Ain't kill nobody. They throw the drill ship away. They've come across the border from time to time. Some of these things are not reported. I had a brother of blessed memory in the army who would tell you sometimes, by a 3-1, you walk into the bush and you turn a corner and you meet a Venezuela patrol. And you gotta exercise your judgment in the ground and decide if you're gonna open fire or just treat the people civilly. Somebody took a line too far, a step too far, and hey, how you do? Okay, think fine. And the Venezuelans turn back, and the GDF turn back. No problem. But they've had individual instances of recent, in 2023. There was credible information that Mr. Maduro was going to do something militarily. I can't go any further than that. Do something militarily. Again, we turn to the international community. Our friends in the international community, that is how that Argyle meeting came about, and the matter was de-escalated. Coming now, see you at the election tomorrow. You want to go there and vote? Where are you going to vote tomorrow? Where's the polling station? Who the candidates you're voting for? There has been any campaign? They don't know, but he's saying these things, so that's a good way, validly, justifiably ask if they're going to come across the border. We have friends, they have friends. I think there's a role for diplomacy in de-escalating these things. We've seen some statements just today. The Canadian High Commissioner issued a tweet, I don't know, about 3 hours ago, saying that Mr. Maduro must hold the election. You will get other messages like that. Also, I will tell you from experience, there's something called quiet diplomacy. Right? Not everything is for the public consumption. It just might be unfair, the people need to know. But some of the things are worked through back channels. Right, so we give a real example. After Mr. Trump lost the first time, and President Biden came in, Trump was ready to do all kind of things, invade and all kind of things, that de-escalated. So America and the US, America and Venezuela were loggerheads. Mr. Biden took a different approach. And talks were going on through the back channel that nobody did know about. using third parties, the same people in our regions that helped us, Ambassador Nylander, to get that conversation going, not to open and shoot bullets. So there are ways of dealing with these issues. I can't promise anybody that nothing would not happen. All I'm saying is that we look over a period of time. Some of the noise and the rhetoric that you hear has not been translated into anything critical or, heaven forbid, fatal. The other thing people need to realize is that nowadays with the social media, you're seeing a lot of things out there that are fabricated. You see some people in the boat in the bush, the Venezuelans are the criminal. You don't know where in the name of the Almighty that video was taken. That's why you need to be careful, act on credible information. There are people like Mr. Greenwich who knows the situation inside out. I can't guarantee you that that's I think the question you posed, they wouldn't come across the border. What I can guarantee you is that the diplomatic skills and access that we have right now through our friends are sufficient enough. You see the evidence, the Canadian High Commissioner has issued something. I think the US ambassador said they were going to issue something. When Mr. Rubio was here the other day, he was very clear. He said it would be, I think, a bad day or a bad week for Venezuela. And you're going to put all of those things into the mix. So I think there's less of a fear that should be there, but people are human beings. You react instinctively to these things. But I think the track record so far has shown that it's more de-escalation than escalation.